everybody. Welcome to my presentation today on the power of schema and how to work in the future of your schema. My name is Kyle Sharati. I am a software engineer at StockX. My Twitter is on here, but it's not at not Kyle Sharati. Feel free to live tweet me. It'll be in the bottom right hand corner if you ever forget about it. So you'll always have it during this presentation. My Twitch is on here. It is exactly my name. You'll see me in chat. I will probably be poking fun at myself the whole time. If you wonder why my face looks familiar, I've been on the Apollo stream a few times. Shout out to Kurt and Trevor Blades. They're awesome. Um, but first, let's talk about today what your schema is today. And what your schema today normally is a set of values and a set of values and objects that you can get from your server that represent your ecosystem as it is today. If you look at it, it is, I want to get the stuff that is currently available for me today. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about is how can we get away from that and get to what your schema is like in the future. And to do that, we're just going to shift our perception a little bit. It's no longer going to be what can I get today and what is available to me today, but it's going to be how can we represent what is available in the future and what's available tomorrow in our graph. Um, but I am not a fortune teller. I cannot tell you what is going to be tomorrow. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you that you're going to add these set things and these other things. But what we can do is we can try to live in that future. And living through that future really has two big components to it. It has a nullability component and it also has a trust component. And the trust component is a little weird, but we don't really like to trust people. The first big thing, like I said, is nullability. Nullability is huge. It's a great thing, but it's also a double-edged sword. Um, I had a very smart engineer before tell me everything is required until it's not required. And that's kind of a weird saying. It's kind of a weird thing to think through. But the big thing about this is it's very hard to get until you have an example. So we're going to kind of walk through an example here and to really illustrate this point. If we take this schema here where we have a query for a video that takes an integer and returns us a video, kind of like a YouTube, very similar to YouTube. It's not YouTube schema. I don't even know if they use GraphQL, but it's something very similar to that. We can walk through this example and see why nullability is a huge thing. And some quick math on this. We said that we had an integer for our ID for our video. I found some internet statistics, and yes, I know they're internet statistics. They're not going to be perfect. Um, but they said about 400 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube every minute. Again, internet statistics. I think that's a little high um, because that's like 24,000 people. It's a lot. So we'll knock that down, take a fourth of it, take 100 hours. And if we kind of do some generalizations and every minute video is about 10 minutes long or takes 10 minutes to upload, YouTube runs out of IDs in less than a year. They run out in right around 249 days. And that's scary. That's a very scary number because you can't use that ID anymore. You have to then update it somehow. And if their number is right and it is 400 versus 100, you actually run out in about 62 days, which is just over 2 months, or it is 2 months, which is very, very scary because again, you'll start to have problems because of that. So us all being engineers, the first thing we say is, oh, how can we fix this? How can we make this not a problem? And I mean, honestly, it's pretty easy. We update our ID to be something other than an integer that gives us more variability in this. So we have a string, we have a big integer, we have something else, right? We don't have that ID any longer. Um, and it's not as simple as it sounds, right? Because we have that one required field, that one required ID, it becomes a little bit different. We can't just say, hey, we're going to take that integer and turn it into a string. That becomes a breaking change. We can't just turn it into a long because that becomes a breaking change. So it's not as simple as just, oh, we have this ID, let's update it. Unless you're willing to take downtime and if you have apps, crashing all of your apps that you've ever released until that point. Um, but don't fear, we can just add another variable, right? Like that's a very valid solution. We're not going to use our ID anymore. We're going to update our schema to look something like this, right? Where we just have a longer integer, or I mean a longer ID. And that will get us to the same thing in the end. So we would say, hey, we got it. Here's our query. Here's our new updated query. We're no longer using that ID. We can put this in here and it'll work. I hate to break it to you, but that's completely wrong. You're actually going to cause a ton of errors in this case. Um, Again, you had a required ID. So what ends up happening is you are forced to pass that in. So you have to do this. You have to put some number there. And when you put that number there, it looks weird, right? Like you have this ID that you've just kind of fabricated out of somewhere because you've had to pass that, which it sucks, right? You're picking this stuff up and you no longer are really making a decision. And that's kind of where this nullability comes in. If we just make these non-nullable, we kind of remove this problem. We no longer have that forced requirement of passing that ID in, which causes us to no longer have any of these fake IDs. So you're no longer, if you have an ID, you're no longer picking a random string to pass in for the longer ID. And if you have a longer ID, you're no longer picking a random integer to pass in and making that kind of weird conversion. And that's really one of the big things that nullability solves in this is you're no longer forced to make these weird fake things. You're no longer forced to have a fake ID or a fake longer ID or fake really anything else, right? Your clients can kind of take that and run and say, this is what I have, this is what I can send you, and I'm not going to make anything fabricated to send to you to make your my query work. You're really allowing your query to then define what is valid, or your client define that, which is very, very nice. And you would ask, like, why do I need to do this? And a big thing on that is you have to do that because you have a required parameter. That required parameter forces you to pass it, regardless if you have it or not. And in the case of this YouTube example, we ran out of IDs. We know, like, my new ID won't have this backwards ID anymore, which causes a lot of problems. And that's a huge deal, right? Like, as soon as you make an ID required or any parameter required, you're married to that for life. Like, as long as that app version lives and you don't want to kill it, you are married to having that ID somewhere and people picking up that ID. And that's the huge problem with this. If you make things nullable, you really allow yourself to have that flexibility in the future to no longer have the old or the legacy code affect what's coming through. You're going to have, of course, your validation logic to say, hey, does this have a new ID? Use that new ID, or have it does it have an old ID? Use that old ID. But you're going to have that regardless. So that one additional check of is it null is a huge thing. And again, nullability is a huge, huge, huge part of this. As soon as you want to have a missing parameter and it's nullable, that's fine. But if it's required, you're still stuck in this weird state of I have to make something and pass it in. And again, the only real drawback to having all this nullability is one more little check of, hey, is this variable also null? Do I have all of the parameters that I really truly need? And then with nullability, we get to this. And again, it looks right. We're back to where we started. This is where we wanted to be the whole time. And nullability really allows us to get there. The second part of this talk and the second part of living in the future is really trusting no one. And we'll explain that a little bit because it sounds really bad at the start, right? But the big thing is trust breeds problems. And that's kind of the point of it, right? Like you don't want to trust the server as a client, and that can lead to a lot of problems when you don't have nullability inserted into places. Again, it leads to some really cool stuff of handling null cases, handling error cases, and really fleshing out what is a valid return. So again, kind of the two big parts of this are servers should not be trusting, or I mean, clients should not be trusting servers to be perfect. And then the other side of the coin is really what is a valid response, and does that include errors? Is that partial returns? And what is the client saying that a valid return is? So one thing before we get too far into it, the first part of this of clients should really not trust servers isn't really part of this talk as much. It's kind of away from the schema and kind of where we want to focus on being in the future of our schema. It's more on site reliability, which is really, really nice. But again, it's kind of away from this. If you guys want to talk about it, please hit me up on Twitter or hit me up in the chat here. It's a really cool topic. There's some really interesting stuff out there. Amazon published a lot of cool stuff, but kind of away from the part of this talk. So let's get back to the second part, which is null cases and handling and what is valid. And I had a very smart engineer once tell me that you can trust, but you have to verify kind of that trust. And that kind of leads into exactly what happens with these responses is did you get a good response and did you get a valid response? And those are two slightly different, questions, but have very different meanings here. Clients have some logic normally to check if your response was an okay response, right? Like in a RESTful world, it's what's your status code? Did I get a 500 or a 400? Because that's a problem. In GraphQL, because we return 200s all the time, it doesn't really tell you if that's a valid or not valid response. You have to go look at your errors. And that's kind of where this comes in here. As you increase the number of as your schema increases, your number of potentially bad responses increase. And the less nullable your schema is, the more problems you're going to run into because something might not be returned. It might cause a problem. And again, it's kind of weird to see. So let's talk through an example here. We're going to go back to basically that the schema we're talking about before about returning a video. A video takes an ID, it gives you back a video. The two things to note again, we have that required ID, and we also have a required ID coming back. So we've been here before. We know that in about 249 days, the number of videos run out, or I mean, the number of IDs run out. So we have to update again to being a big int or a string or anything. And that's what you can see in here. Um, and now, what's wrong with the schema? And that's kind of the big part here that comes out of it is even in your return types, you're telling the clients that they're always going to get stuff back. And as a server, when you're telling them you're going to get stuff back, you have to make that decision of I don't have an ID. What do I give back to the client? And that really hampers some stuff here. Um, if you don't have an ID, what do you return for the other one? If you don't have an ID as a negative number, a valid return to tell the client that hey, it doesn't work out right, it didn't work. And then the other huge thing on this is what becomes a valid response. If I am only requesting a longer ID, is it valid that I might not get one if I only have an ID to give you back or I give you an empty string back? All of this stuff is kind of what ends up poking at like, do I need these required fields and should I have these required fields? And what evolves out of that is again, nullability really, really helps in this case as you make your schema more nullable, you don't have to then return these values of, oh, hey, I got a longer ID, but I didn't get a normal ID. So I have to return you -1 to try to tell you that it worked out and hope that you request both IDs at all times. And that really shifts the control when you add that nullability from the server dictating what you're going to get of you're always going to get this stuff back. You're always going to have this. This is always going to be a valid response because I'm forced to give you it back or you kind of go the other way and say, I'm going to give you back what I have on the server. And I'm going to allow you to decide is that a valid response or is it not a valid response? Because if you get an ID back, that may be a valid response for older clients. But if you don't get a longer ID back on a new client, is that a problem or can you handle the old legacy client? And all of that stuff really wraps on top of each other. And it really shifts that burden of what's a valid return type from your schema and your server, where you're going to have problems evolving that to your client for when they've made a request and they get something back. Does it is it valid for them to then potentially pass back to the next thing? Can they move on to their next thing? And that's a huge part of this. And then to wrap up in the last set of this presentation, we'll talk about why do you want to live in the future? Why do you want to do this? Um, One of the big benefits is you have a lot less breaking changes. Um, Making stuff from required to null is normally some type of a breaking change on a client, right? It's not going to hurt you on the server, but if you say, "Hey, I'm going to return you this," and now you're not going to return them that, and a null gets fit in through there, that becomes a breaking change a lot of times, and that's really really painful for really evolving your apps because again you're forced to kind of keep some of this legacy stuff around all the time. The another big part, easier evolvability. So as your graph evolves and becomes a better representation of what you guys are going to provide to your clients, you're no longer stuck in this like, oh well, I have to return this value or I can't really change this value because it could break something. When you bake in that nullability, you're already baking in the error handling for that, and that's a huge benefit of this. There's a lot less lock-in and schema too, which is a huge, huge, huge benefit. Kind of goes along with that evolvability, but as stuff is more and more nullable, you're no longer forced to lock this schema kind of in a section and say, hey, we can't touch this. Hey, we can't move with this. If it may not be super nice for clients, it may not be nice for consumers, but hey, we're stuck in this section here. So that is a huge benefit as well. We touched on this a little bit. Better null and error handling is a huge benefit to nullability and not trusting people. Is if you have that baked into your schema where as you're writing your code, it tells you, hey, could be null. How do you want to handle it? Or this could be the other way. How do you want to handle it? That is a huge benefit of this way of thinking is the more nullability you add, the more you're asking your clients as a server to handle and validate that their response is what they want. Where before, if you have required things, it's assuming that it's always going to be okay, which is never the case. In the last, but yet the probably biggest thing that you can get out of the benefit of getting this way and adding more nullability and doing less trust between your clients and server is you can really decouple stuff, which is awesome. Your front end can then no longer be dependent on your back end, and your back end can kind of develop stuff independently of your front end. And the huge benefit to this, and this is huge, we've done it. I talked today at Launch Darkly Galaxy about the same thing and how you look at it from the feature flag side, but clients can actually ship their code way, way early if the scheme is agreed upon and nullable. If it's nullable and they get something back, they might hide a home screen row. They might hide some pictures. They might do something that, what would happen if in tomorrow something went wrong? They can do that today, potentially without, throwing red banners everywhere and slapping airs on everything. But you can ship that early and then ship it behind a feature flag. And then when that feature flag is ready, because the schema is actually being populated by a backend, you can turn it on and you don't have to do deploys. And you can really break apart that stuff, that front end and back end dependencies, as long as you really split out the schema of being nullable and really returning potentially nothing and or a bunch of nulls. And that's a huge part and benefit of this. So taking a very quick look back at everything we've kind of talked about and covered a little bit, um, what would really happen if we started with nulls, right? Like we really started this with like, hey, I have a required field, I have something required. Um, if you started with nulls, this whole conversation is a very moot point. Um, you would have zero breaking changes. You have had no problems putting in all of these IDs, these longer IDs that we talked about, and your returns would have had no problems handling all that because again, they would have handled that null case to start with. But because we put in that requiredness at the start, that's where this problem comes from. And if we just shift that away from everything needs to be required to everything might not be there in the future, it really, really helps with a lot of these cases. And again, this whole talk becomes a moot point because you would look at me and say, yeah, I know I don't have to have any of these problems, which is kind of the point of nullability. In parting, we are hiring at StockX. Our jobs page is here. If you go to stockx.com, just go down to the bottom. There's a jobs link there if you don't remember this one as well. We have a tech blog. It's out there. We have some good GraphQL content out there, which is awesome. So that's pretty cool. Where to find me? Again, my Twitter is at not Kyle Sharati, and my Twitch is on here. I'm sure I'm in chat poking fun at myself at this point. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everybody, all of the Apollo folks who have done stuff here. It's been awesome. Thank you for everything.